Hello, here we are again. Lecture 3 on light in August. At the end of last class, I'd noted the ironic similarities between Joe Christmas and McGurkin, the adoptive father he rebels against and despises. I noted that in his early childhood, Joe acquires McGurkin's habit of cold, systematic violence and McGurkin's misogyny, but he also imbibes a version of McGurkin's moral rigidity. As the fundamentalist zealot beats Joe for refusing to memorize his Presbyterian catechism, Faulkner describes the boy's face looking like that of a monk or a Catholic choir boy, paradoxically sanctified by his militant resistance to McGurkin's religious indoctrination. It's an instance of the oscillating reflexivity among Faulkner's characters, but also an illustration of how Joe Christmas has paradoxically internalized aspects of McGurkin's stubbornness, so that he resembles McGurkin even as he is rebelling against the man and his religion. Joe also absorbs aspects of McGurkin's fundamentalist moral perversity. McGurkin believes that man is so intrinsically sinful that he must beg God's absolution for eating food rather than thanking God. Any sensual pleasure for McGurkin is an affront to God, especially sex. Now, we've already seen that Joe, even as a 5-year-old living at the orphanage, needed to punish himself for the oral and sexual gratification of consuming toothpaste in the dietitian's room. Well, living with McGurkin only intensifies his early guilty sense that eating and sex are impure abominations, and both of them linked with women. This amplified misogynist inheritance from McGurkin becomes evident in Joe's rejection of Mrs. McGurkin's food after McGurkin has beaten him. He dumps the tray that she brings to his bed, and he feels no sympathetic identification with this abused, downtrodden woman who McGurkin has, quote, hammered thinner and thinner like passive metal. Joe doesn't reject the food to punish his adoptive mother for failing to protect him from the whipping. Rather, he rejects the food because he senses female deceit in this secret offering that she makes behind her husband McGurkin's back. Perhaps he's recalling, Joe is, the dietitian's offer of a silver dollar. But he also rejected that one as he rejects this food, linking them with deceit. Joe hates both female deceit and this woman's attempt to put him emotionally under her power and in her debt by smuggling him food. Years later, when he's 18, Joe fears that he will be, quote, doomed to be forever a victim of this woman's soft kindness, of her secret conspiracies. Now, Mrs. McGurkin lies to her husband to protect Joe after he sells his heifer to buy a suit, claiming that she bought it for him with the money she secretly saved. It's part of what Joe regards as, quote, woman's affinity and instinct for secrecy, which carries with it for Joe a taint of evil and seems to demand an emotional obligation from him. Overhearing Mrs. McGurkin pleading to protect him, at one point he thinks she's trying to make me cry. Then she thinks they would have me. Even when Joe first arrived, his fear of submission to Mrs. McGurkin's female emotive appeals caused him to resist her embraces. He felt uneasy when she bathed his feet in warm water, as if he feared immersion in a female element and feared submission to a woman's coercive trickery. Faulkner tells us, she knelt before Joe while he watched the crown of her head and her hands fumbling a little clumsily about his feet. He didn't try to help her now. He didn't know what she was trying to do, nor even when he was sitting with his cold feet in the warm water. He didn't know what that was at all, because it felt too good. He was waiting for the rest of it to begin, the part that would not be pleasant, whatever it would be. Always this suspicion. By now, Joe has come to associate, as we've seen, food with unpleasure and with female coercion in particular. ever since his toothpaste eating and vomiting in the dietitian's room. So he eats his adoptive mother's food suspiciously and resentfully, including the dishes she brings to him secretly after the whipping. As we've noted, these he promptly dumped onto the floor in an act of resistance. Another illustration of McErkin's paradoxical moral influence on Joe is when Joe is 14 and he has his first would-be sexual encounter. He is one in a group of boys who are taking turns with a black girl at an old mill. When it's Joe's turn to climb on top of her, he reacts with revulsion and aggression against the female. His instinctive memory of eating toothpaste as a forbidden erotic experience combines here with his conscious memory of McErkin, who had preached against the evils of sin, sex in particular, as sin. Thus, we're told, perhaps he did not even think of it as a sin until he thought of the man who would be waiting for him at home, since to 14 the paramount sin would be to be publicly convicted of virginity. But his turn came. He entered the shed, and it was dark. At once he was overcome by the terrible haste. There was something in him trying to get out, like when he had used to think of the toothpaste. But he could not move at once, standing there, smelling the woman, smelling the Negro all at once, enclosed by the woman's Negro, something prone and abject. Her eyes, perhaps, moved him. Leaning, he seemed to look down into the black well, and at the bottom saw two glints like the reflection of dead stars. And so he kicked her hard, kicking her into and through a choked wail of surprise and fear. She began to scream, he jerking her up, clutching her by the arm, hitting her with his wide, wild blows, striking at the voice perhaps, feeling her flesh anyway, enclosed by the woman's Negro and her haste. Then she fled his fist, and he too fled backward as the other boys fell upon him, swarming, grappling, fumbling, he striking back, his breath hissing with rage and despair. Together, these inheritances from McErkin fill Joe Christmas with a violent contempt for this black girl. She embodies carnal corruption and the temptation to sin, which filled Joe with a renewed hatred of his own sexualized body. His response to this sexual temptation indeed sets the pattern for his later life, in which he will violently assault women, culminating in the killing of Joanna Burden, hating himself for his desire all along. Thus, he attacks the girl and thereby ensures that he himself will be violently beaten, violently punished for his sexual desire, for the contamination and the sin of sex. And so he is, we're told. They held him down, holding him helpless. Will you quit now? We got you. Promise to quit. No, he said, and heaved, twisting. Quit. And then there was a spontaneous fight, a compulsion of the male to fight with or because of over the partner with which he recently or is about to copulate. But none of them saw why Joe had to fight. He has to fight to be beaten. Now, Faulkner reminds us that the white boys who punch Joe are not doing so to protect the black girl that they have been having sex with. They are acting instead on, quote, an automatic reflex to fight over a partner with whom one is about to copulate. What Joe rages against in this particular girl, and in himself, however, is more than just sexuality. It is also, of course, the girl's blackness, which reminds Joe of his own despised secret blackness. He strikes out against that. This moment marks the beginning of Joe's association of blackness with corrupt female sexuality, thus the conflation of a single word, woman's Negro, linked in his mind now. A connection that we saw powerfully when Joe was an adult during his hypnotic walk through Freedmanstown, when again that sense of blackness and femaleness were inextricable, and where as he walked, he feared both being taken for a white man in a black neighborhood and also feared being recognized as a black. But more deeply, remember, that night Joe had wanted to beat a black man so that he could in turn be beaten by the black community. Here, as a 14-year-old, we see something similar. After striking the black girl, he wants to be attacked by the other boys, and is. Put simply then, Joe needs to be punished here, both for being aroused by the girl with the sinful nature of sex inherent, but also for the shameful secret of his own blackness, which he has been taught to hate in himself and needs to punish when he sees this girl who arouses him. Well, after the boys pummel Joe, he feels what Faulkner describes as, quote, an ecstasy and self-crucifixion. Well, Joe Christmas's entire life hereafter might be described as a prolonged self-crucifixion. It's a telling word, after all, for a man whose initials, J.C., are obviously an echo of Christ, an individual who, like Christ, is destined to die, and one who is 33 years old when he appears in the novel. His every act of aggression redounds on himself as it is meant to, in a perpetual cycle of violence and self-flagellation. When he isn't creating conditions in which others can beat him, he will make himself sick, as he did with the toothpaste, or in some way injure himself. There is, however, a part of Joe Christmas that would like to escape this cycle I've just described, that ordeal, that would like to get beyond his ingrained sense of sexual sinfulness in the absence of any religious belief, and would like to get beyond his hatred of women, his misogynistic distrust, would like to get beyond, above all, his hatred of both black and white worlds, and the attendant hatred of himself as both black and white. Get beyond, then, the need to beat and to be beaten. He'd like to get beyond all of that, some part of him. But to do so would be, if only he could do so, to find what Joe Christmas repeatedly calls peace. And yet he never succeeds in this, though he does make attempts. Indeed, his first attempt, I think, to escape his self-injurious compulsions and rage comes when he is 18. He sells the cow McKirkin had given him to buy a suit so that he can go to town and meet a woman. When McKirkin finds the hidden suit and learns that Joe has sold the cow to buy it, he strikes Joe in the face, to which Joe responds, "Don't you hit me again." These are words of resistance. But Joe says this, "Don't you hit me again," as he is, quote, licking his own blood from McKirkin's blow, implying that Joe needs this punishing violence directed against him, even as he rebels against the man who has administered it. This is part of a pattern, then, that we've seen already that is going to continue. Joe will demand to be hit by others in the weeks and years to come, trapped in a cycle of rage and self-inflicted injury that leads, essentially, the forces of hatred and self-hatred to imprison him, notwithstanding his attempts periodically to find what he calls peace. We're told of this period that when he went to bed that night, his mind was made up to run away after he's been struck and licked his own blood. Don't hit me again. He felt like an eagle, hard, sufficient, potent, remorseless, strong. But that passed, though he did not then know that, like the eagle, his own flesh, as well as all space, was still a cage. Now, that's a crucial word, given Joe's continual inability to break beyond his hatred and self-hatred. The mixed race flesh, his own body that Faulkner describes there, that flesh that Joe so often examines, is his cage. His sexual appetite is also his cage. His early instinctive memories of women are a cage. His internalized sense of sin, all of these are cages. But above all, Joe is encaged, one might say, even beyond his despised body and everything sexual and racial associated with it. He is above all encaged by the cultural legacy of racial hatred and fear in the South. It is distilled in his mixed race origins, in his white and black blood. He can't escape the destructive and self-destructive repercussions of his mixed blood inheritance that originate this particular cage long before he was ever born. This is, I think you'll agree, a bleak vision of human possibility, and it seems to negate agency altogether. But does it really mean that Faulkner's universe is completely deterministic, say like that of Zola and the late 19th century naturalists who claimed that they could chart the inevitable trajectory of any life based on heredity and environment? No, Faulkner doesn't go quite that far, because we're going to see there are moments in which some characters, though not most of them, but some, become sufficiently conscious of the forces operating within them and upon them through history and in their minds and bodies, sufficiently conscious of those forces to make small independent choices in defiance of their family inheritances and in defiance of their unconsciously internalized inclinations. We're going to see such gestures in particular, I think, in Hightower and in Byron Bunch. But these moments of agency are sporadic, and even when they operate, they do so within social parameters that Faulkner's characters, after all, can never get beyond, any more than Hightower or Joanna Burden can get beyond the perimeter, so it seems, of a place where they are despised. No one, however, is more tragically encaged in this novel than Joe Christmas. Chapter 8 begins with Joe climbing down a rope that he has hidden to go to a tryst with Bonnie, the waitress he met months before. We then get the backstory of this relationship as it develops in secret before looping back to the same moment of Joe's descent down that rope at the start of Chapter 9. There we see that event from McCurkin's point of view as he lies awake waiting for Joe to reveal his carnal depravity when he goes to follow him. Now, ironically, it is through McCurkin that Joe actually meets Bobby when, reluctantly, McCurkin takes him to a diner where she is a waitress when the two of them have to go to town. And we later learn that she is not just a waitress in this diner, but she is also a part-time prostitute for the diner's owner, Max. McCurkin instructs Joe never to come to a place like this on his own. It is almost certainly, he tells him, a den of iniquity. Quote, "I'll not have you go there unless I am with you." Well, this prohibition, of course, helps to impel Joe's rebellion. He's rebellious by nature. It's in his fundamental instinctive DNA. It impels Joe's rebellion in the same way that being told when he first arrived that your name is now McCurkin impelled immediately Joe's determination to go instead by the name Christmas. It's by the name Christmas that Joe introduces himself to Bobby, who he has seen and watched on his first visit to the diner. Despite Joe's hatred and suspicion of women, the fact is that at 17, he is dominated by his sexual needs, and his attraction to Bonnie is immediate and predictable, so that when they he and his adoptive father, next go to town, he deliberately violates McCurkin's order when they temporarily separate and revisits the restaurant, goes back to the diner with money in his pocket to spend there. Now, his prior experience, remember, with women makes this particular attraction to Bonnie in some ways inevitable, because she seems at first to be quite different from any of the women whom he has learned to distrust and respond to with disgust. We're told that the waitress, the woman, was not much larger than a child, going back and forth to the kitchen with her arms laden with dishes. Her face was musing, demure, and downcast. Joe took that coin and went straight to the restaurant then. He did not even put the coin into his pocket. He did it without plan or design, almost without volition, as if his feet ordered his action, not his head. There is something about her that draws him to her. He is drawn initially to Bonnie because of her childlike size, which allows him to think of her as different from the mature women who loomed over him when he was a small child and whom he associates with deceit and secrecy, specifically the dietitian and Mrs. McGurkin. We're told, quote, if she had been a big woman, he would not have dared. But as a childlike woman, she is more akin in his mind to that 12-year-old girl who was so kind to him in the orphanage, whom he didn't think of as a woman at all. Also, because Bobby is small and white, she seems to Joe virginal, unlike the black girl he beat 3 years earlier, who called to mind sexual corruption and his own blackness, who made him feel a sense of self-revulsion both as a sexual being and as one with black blood. Now, Joe is, of course, wrong about Bonnie in every respect of his initial view of her. It's a misjudgment suggested, I think, by Faulkner's recurrent description of Bobby's unusually large hands, which seem to put the lie to her diminutive innocence as Joe first imagines it. Gazing at her, we're told, Joe feels like a young stallion in a state of unbelieving and ecstatic astonishment in a hidden pasture. In short, he's driven by sexual desire, but in looking at her, convinces himself that it is something other than sexual desire, something more natural and pure and elevated and innocent. Faulkner's narrator translates Joe's unarticulated feelings for Bobby in a lyrical, italicized transmission. I do not know yet that in the instant of sleep, the eyelid closing prisons within the eye's self, her face, demure, pensive, tragic, sad and young, waiting, colored with all the vague and formless magic of young desire, that already there is something for love to feed upon, that sleeping I know not why I struck refraining that Negro girl 3 years ago, and that she must know it too and be proud to with the waiting and the pride. I know now why I struck the black girl, because she was your antithesis, not only racially, but she was corruptly sexualized and called forth desire in me. You do not. So he imagines of Bobby. Now, when in the restaurant, Bobby protects Joe by lying and saying that he ordered only pie and not the coffee that she poured. She does this to spare him the humiliation of being unable to pay for the entire meal. There's a problem with this, however, because remember, first of all, it was he knows that this is a lie, a fabrication to protect him, and it was, after all, dishonesty that he associated both with the dietitian and with the protective intervention of Mrs. McGurkin on his behalf. He hates it in Mrs. McGurkin. The idea then of being protected by a woman and feeling that that protection involves a lie is something that connects Bobby all too painfully with adult women he has known. So when Joe slinks out of the diner feeling, quote, it's terrible to be young, it's with the burden of disillusionment and shame and indebtedness to a woman that Joe feels he can free himself from and dismiss and get beyond only by returning to pay the nickel that he owes. At this point, she has already become contaminated in his mind with associations with other adult women. But the fact that Joe is willing to go so far to leave 50 cents that he takes from his foster mother, the fact that he is willing to go so far as to steal to get that money reflects the magnification of that unpaid debt in his mind, a debt not merely in coin, but a debt that he does not want to carry around with him for Bobby's intervention. He does not want to be in any way beholden to her or any other woman. But when Joe tries to repay the money, Max, the owner, dismisses him as a con artist who's trying, quote, to make a girl here with a nickel. Well, as Joe rushes out again in a panic of shame, he runs into Bobby now on the street. She's stunned that, quote, you came back to give it to me. And their affair begins shortly thereafter. An affair now driven without much idealization on Joe's part, simply by his erotic desire, despite the guilt associated with that desire. Well, in order for this affair to begin at all, though, Joe must engage in certain kinds of psychological gymnastics. First, even though he has already associated Bobby with other adult women, he must at least temporarily disavow her association with those women he has known. And he must also try to deny something still more frightening about her, the fact that women menstruate. Menstruation, in a sense, being the manifestation of the corruption he associates with women's bodies. When Joe and Bobby meet again, she explains that she had forgotten her period was coming and therefore can't be with him that night. That is to say, I cannot have sex with you because I am having my period. Now, Joe, remember, already associates women with moral corruption, and living with Mrs. McGurkin has reinforced his association forged by his experiences with the promiscuous dietitian and the black girl. Women are fundamentally morally corrupt. Now, as Bobby describes menstruation, he thinks of all women as infected with physical corruption insofar as all women menstruate. It's not just that they are morally corrupt, deceitful, and manipulative, they are also by nature corporeally corrupt. Quote, all women experience inescapable intervals, he thought, of periodic filth. Now, this is not the first time that Joe has ever heard of menstruation, but when as a boy he heard it described to him 3 years earlier, Joe was so horrified at the thought of vaginal bleeding that he needed then to disavow it. But in order to do so, that is to say, in order to repress his awareness of menstruation in women, Joe felt that he first had to witness bloodletting in some form. So he killed a sheep and immersed his hands in its warm blood in an attempt to demystify a horrifying female mystery that he's afraid to encounter and would like to deny. Well, by putting himself through this ordeal of sheep's blood, Joe paradoxically felt that he could both acknowledge menstruation as a fact and at the same time dismiss this corruption from any connection to his own personal life. He had not forgot what the boy had told him. He just accepted it. He found that he could live with it side by side with it. It was as if he said, illogically and desperately calm, all right, it is so then, but not for me, not in my life, not in my love. Now, by doing this, Joe felt that he had, quote, bought immunity from the ugly truth of women's periodic bleeding. But Bobby's disclosure that she is having her period means that he can no longer maintain this fiction of denial about the irrelevance of menstruation in his personal life. Nor, when she tells him this, can he maintain the illusion, if he was ever able to at all, that Bobby is somehow childlike and innocent. He had already seen her act protectively and deceitfully, and that reminded him of adult women, but now menstruation eliminates any vestiges of childlike innocence in her, though it is only later that he discovers that she is a prostitute who sleeps with other men in Max's house. Well, Joe is enraged that yet another woman has, as he sees it, tricked him by bringing him to meet her for an assignation and then turning him away. But he is still more enraged by Bobby's explanation, which recalls the violent revulsion he'd experienced when he killed the sheep. So he strikes her then, after she tells him that she's having her period, strikes her before running off into the dark woods. Oh, and he'd heard it before. He had already fled backwards, past the slain sheep, the price paid for immunity, to the afternoon when, sitting on a creek bank, he had been not hurt or astonished so much as outraged. The arm which she had jerked free, she did not believe that he would have intended to strike her. She believed otherwise, in fact, but the result was the same. And she stood as he left her then, motionless, down-looking, as though waiting for the blow which she had already received from him. Like all of Joe's violence, this act is directed both against the world, in this case against women, and also against himself. It's a self-lacerating punishment for his own naivete and the sexual desire that has led him to encounter this reminder of female impurity. He is as enraged at himself as he is at Bobby. A moment later, he vomits, repeating the same self-induced punishment he had in the orphanage for yielding to forbidden erotic pleasures when he was 5. It's the same self-punishing instinct for what he feels is, even before McGurkin, the moral impurity of sexual desire. Only later does Joe realize that Bobby was actually waiting for him to hit her, that this woman with the abject, downward-turned face is accustomed to being beaten by men when she isn't available. Now, because Joe is driven by ungovernable sexual desire, even though he hates it in himself, he meets Bobby once again, but now with no illusions about her purity or difference from other women. Now he regards his immersion in a woman's body as corruption, regards the act of sex itself as depraved. And it finally occurs to him that, in fact, sex, therefore, must be violent. It must be an expression of hatred of the very thing you are engaging in. In short, it must be an act in which Joe punishes both the woman and, by extension, himself. Because even as he is rebelling, as I've noted, against McGurkin, he feels deeply that fornication is a terrible sin that must carry its own punishment with it. And so we're told on their next meeting, he drew Bobby from the road toward the fence, which he had just crossed a week ago. "Wait," she said, the words jolting from her mouth. "The fence, I can't." As she stooped to go through between the strands of wire which he had stepped over, her dress caught. He leaned and jerked it free with a ripping sound. "I'll buy you another one," he said. She said nothing. She let herself be half carried, half dragged among the growing plants and furrows, into the woods, into the trees. Now, note that the rope that Joe hides to climb down to these meetings is described as the implement of his sin, because he regards what he's doing as absolutely and appallingly wrong. Faced with this guilt, nonetheless, he still tries to delude himself into believing at times that this carnality, this attraction to Bobby, isn't just carnality, that somehow it can be normalized, that in some way what he already knows can be disavowed in the same way he had tried as a boy to disavow menstruation. And so in this attempt to get beyond the sense of sex as mere violent sin that requires its own violent punishment, he brings Bobby a box of stale chocolates, unaware that other men give her money in exchange for sex. When Bobby takes him into her room to have sex, she shows this gift of chocolates to the cynical Max and Mame, as if to show them that her relationship with Joe isn't and should not be regarded as part of the profession that she's been brought down from Memphis by them to practice. And she now shows Joe, for the first time, her naked body. It's a gesture of openness that moves Joe and prompts him in return to tell her that he believes that he is part black. It is now Bobby who practices the disavowal. Quote, "I don't believe it," she said. The response only intensifies Joe's hatred of his own blackness and intensifies his need to conceal it. At the same time, however, Bobby's contemptuous gesture of denying that he could possibly be black, because she clearly finds that thought disgusting, that reaction also increases Joe's need for aggression against her, especially when he comes to her house and discovers that she is with another man. Then, we are told, as he approaches the house and sees that someone else is with her, "It's just Max," he thought. "It's just Max." But he knew better. He knew that there was a man in the room with Bobby. He did not see her for 2 weeks, though he knew that she was waiting for him. Then one night, he was at the corner when she appeared. He struck her without warning, feeling her flesh. He knew then that even yet he had not believed. "Oh," she cried. He struck her again. "Not here," she whimpered, "not here." Then he found that he was crying. He had not cried since he could remember. He cried, cursing her sinking heart. As always with Joe Christmas, the violence against another is also self-injurious. He weeps as he strikes her as if he were striking himself, and striking himself to punish him for his self-imposed ignorance about Bobby. Quote, "I thought you knew," Bobby said. That is to say, "I thought you knew I slept with other men for money. How could you not know?" Now, after this, Joe sometimes pays Bobby for sex. He goes out now drinking with other men, and he sneaks out at night down that rope, and he calls Bobby his whore. He's been stripped of his illusions and stripped of his attempted disavowals, and now feels consumed with moral self-disgust and self-hatred. Yet he simmers with suppressed rage at Bobby, both for her betrayals and for her rejection of his blackness, even though, of course, he hates that blackness himself. Joe continues these self-corrupting habits, immersing himself into what he feels is wrong and evil, partly as a rebellion against McGurkin's indoctrination, and partly out of a desperate despair at his entrapment. After all, where else could he go? Trapped as he is at McGurkin's, and now trapped in a vortex of his own guilt and self-disgust. When McGurkin follows Joe one night after lying awake and hearing him go down the rope, follows Joe on his aging white horse, McGurkin finds him at a country dance, and he feels that he has been directed to that location by higher powers, as if the archangel Michael were leading him to a place where he can now scourge the satanic sin out of his adopted son. Followed by a wake of astonishment when he arrived, there was incipient pandemonium at the dance. McGurkin ran toward the youth whom he had adopted of his own free will and whom he had tried to raise as he was convinced was right. Joe and the waitress were dancing, and Joe had not yet seen him. Yet he went straight to her, ignoring Joe for the moment. "Away, Jezebel," he said. "Away, harlot." On all sides the sluttishness of weak human man seethed in a long sigh of terror about the actual representation of the wrathful and retributive throne. Perhaps they were not even his hands which struck at the face of the youth whom he had nurtured and sheltered and clothed as a child. And perhaps when the face ducked his blow and came up again, it was not the face of that child, not that child's face which he was concerned with. No, for McGurkin, it was the face of Satan, which he now knew as well. And when, staring at the face, McGurkin walked steadily toward it, with his hand still raised, very likely he walked toward it in the furious and dreamlike exultation of a martyr who has already been absolved into the descending chair which Joe swung at his head and into nothingness. Perhaps the nothingness astonished McGurkin a little, but not much, and not for long. Joe strikes McGurkin with the chair only after taking the old man's blows, which Joe knows he needs and even desires for the sins he's committing. Even in his act of rebellion against McGurkin, so deeply has he internalized the need for punishment that he accepts it. And even after striking out at McGurkin, Joe ironically reveals how deeply he has internalized the zealot's view of human sinfulness, because as he makes his way back home to steal money from Mrs. McGurkin and run away, Joe feels that he has, quote, consigned himself to hell. The blow alone against McGurkin, he feels, was enough to damn him. Whether or not he actually killed McGurkin or not, it was simply the assault that will do it. We're told the youth rode the old white horse back, rode lightly, balanced lightly, leaning well forward, exulting perhaps at that moment as Faustus did, of having put behind now at once and for all the thou shalt not, of being free at last of honor and law and morality. There's almost a momentary liberation in feeling that he's damned. Similarly, when Joe steals from Mrs. McGurkin, he embraces his sin with a sense of hopeless depravity. He tells her, I didn't ask you for this money. I just took it. He is denouncing. He denounces her feminine attempts to bind him emotionally, as her husband had tried to bind him with hard work and religion, and he defies her here, but at the same time insists upon the fact that he is sinning and knows it. He's damned. Well, as Joe drives the horse back to town, beating it mercilessly, he imagines momentarily that he is free. Free of his foster father, free of the lawfulness, free of the conscience, but of course he isn't free at all, even in the idea that he has liberated himself through accepting damnation. He's not free because he can never outrun the past that is both inside of him and outside of him in the form of the South itself. Thus, Faulkner reminds us that Joe looks like McGurkin as he moves here, not with a sense of freedom, but rather with a sense of destiny. Quote, he ran with his father's complete faith in the infallibility of events as he moves back to town. Now, it's the same sense of destiny that Joe now feels as he moves that had led McGurkin to find him at the dance. Throughout the chapter, Faulkner describes Joe as running. When he is not beating this horse, he is running and running and running. But whether he is moving or standing still, it's clear that Joe is trapped by what the inherited past and his own very youthful experiences have made of him. He cannot escape them. For a man who hates the world and hates himself, there is no direction in which movement can in any way bring a sense of freedom, only self-destruction. When Joe steals the money, for example, consider what we are told. He laughed back into the lamp. He turned his head, and his laughing, running up the stairs, vanishing as he ran, vanishing upward from the head down, as if he were running headfirst and laughing into something that was obliterating him, like a picture in chalk being erased from a blackboard. The more he attempts to run, and we'll see this late in the novel, the more he is not only confined, but the more in which he is in a process of self-erasure, of self-destruction, like chalk being erased from a blackboard. And yet another image of black and white. When Joe rides McGurkin's horse back to town, he does so then with the same feeling of urgency as his adopted father had in seeking him. And the poor animal's inability to continue under this beating reflects Joe's own immobility. There is no real escape from his past, or from himself. The horse slowed, sheering to the curb, and Joe pulled at its head, beating it. Yet still the rider leaned forward in the arrested saddle in an attitude of terrific speed, beating the horse across the rump with his stick. Then Joe raised the stick and fell to beating the horse about its motionless head. He beat it steadily until the stick broke. He continued to strike it with a fragment not much longer than his hand, and then, giving up, he ran as completely out of the life of the horse as if it had never existed. The fact that the old horse he beats is white reminds us that Joe's self-injurious rage is not just against McGurkin, but against the entire white world that McGurkin represents and to which he belongs. It is a race Joe distrusts and despises all the more because he finds that he must lie in order to pass as part of it. This rage, born of a mixed race hatred that demands his self-hatred, this rage is the ultimate trap that Joe cannot escape. The trap of his mixed race heritage and the assimilated hatred within him of white and black from his entire culture. Yet, as Joe rushes down into town, he desperately and self-delusively imagines that Bobby will run away with him. This despite the fact that Bobby denounced Joe and tried to attack him when McGurkin had called her a harlot at the dance. This downtrodden woman can accept that label from her customers, but she will not accept it as a moral judgment from this old man. Now, this suggests that Bobby's rage at both McGurkin and Joe are rooted in moral shame that the old man McGurkin has aroused in her, and that sense of shame is the same shame, of course, that McGurkin has inculcated in Joe, and that, like Joe, Bobby strikes out at others because she feels a sense of contempt and guilt in herself. Bobby, projecting that guilt, blames Joe for, quote, putting the old man at me, and her rage at Joe intensifies because, after all, Joe has then assaulted McGurkin and in so doing threatened Bobby's livelihood. The possibility that he may have killed the man as he was attempting to defend her, forces Bobby, along with Max and Mame, to leave town that night in order to evade a police investigation of the incident that would expose their prostitution operation. She's enraged at him for this. When Joe arrives at the house then, Max and Mame and Bobby are about to depart. And when he approaches Bobby, he is beaten and robbed of the money that he stole from his foster mother. This over Mame's objections, who leaves him a single bill as compensation. Now, Bobby also betrays his racial secret in revenge at this time, as Brown will later betray that secret. Before leaving, she says, "Bastard, son of a bitch, getting me into a jam that always treated you like you were a white man." Well, predictably, Joe hears this and reacts to the slur with violence, as always, as a means to violence that he hopes will redound on himself as a punishment, both for his blackness and for his foolishly disclosing the secret to Bonnie in the past. They fill him with self-contempt that draws this response. He sprang forward upon the two men. Very likely he did not even know that they were already moving toward him, because with something of the exultation of his adopted father, he sprang full at them of his own accord into the stranger's fists. And when they have knocked him down, one of them says, clearly a racist, "We'll see if his blood is black." Lying peaceful and still, Joe watched the stranger lean down and lift his head from the floor and strike him again in the face, this time with a short, slashing blow. After a moment, he licked his lip a little, somewhat as a child might lick a cooking spoon. He watched the stranger's hand go back, but it did not fall. That's enough. Let's go to Memphis. Just one more. Joe lay quietly and watched the hand. Then Max was beside the stranger, stooping. We'll need a little bit more blood, just to tell for sure. This brief exultation Joe feels here in being beaten is the fulfillment of that need to be injured, which he wanted in striking out at this man. And again, as before with McGurkin, even as he strikes out, he licks the blood of the beating he's received because he needs it. He's exalted in the sense that this is the fulfillment, the gratification of that moral masochism that he practices, wherein every act of aggression against the world, white or black, is really a self-inflicted wound. Well, even as Joe assaults the white race for its cruelty and its betrayal, he also paradoxically welcomes the blows as punishment for his blackness. During his 15 years of wandering hereafter, all of his aggression is ultimately self-directed. It's part of Joe's long self-crucifixion. His need for self-laceration includes the internalization of McGurkin's moral scourging, but it also transcends that training because Joe's need for suffering derives not just from what he has done, that is to say, it derives not just from his sense that he has sinned, but it derives this need to be punished from what he is. In short, the ultimate source of Joe's compulsion to self-punishment is ontological. Now, earlier in Joe's childhood, Faulkner wrote, quote, that memory believes before knowing remembers, suggesting that Joe is shaped by very early childhood experiences that are stored emotionally and unconsciously before conscious recollection actually begins. But now, in describing Joe as an adult who escapes into the night and goes off wandering for 15 years, Faulkner writes, knowing, not grieving, remembers 1,000 savage and lonely streets. That is, Joe's more recent memories as an adult, unlike his very early childhood experiences, are now a fully conscious form of knowing and remembering. One might say that there is no therapeutic benefit from this act of remembering, though. Certainly not the kind, say, that Dr. S recommends to Zeno. There is nothing to be gained. There is no cure that comes through the act of this remembering. We get a cinematic montage of what Joe experiences during these peripatetic 15 years on the road, as Faulkner describes them. We're told that from that night after being beaten at Max's, the 1,000 streets ran as one street, with imperceptible corners and changes of scene, broken by intervals of begged and stolen rides on trains and trucks and on country wagons, when at 20 and 25 and 30, sitting on the seat with his still hard face and the clothes, even when soiled and worn, of a city man, and the driver of the wagon not knowing who or what the passenger was, nor daring to ask. The street ran into Oklahoma and Missouri and as far south as Mexico, and then back north to Chicago and Detroit, and then back south again, at last to Mississippi. It was 15 years long. He was by turns a laborer, a miner, prospector, gambling tout. He enlisted in the army, served 4 months and deserted, and was never caught. And always, sooner or later, the street ran through cities, through an identical and well-nigh interchangeable section of cities without remembered names, where beneath dark and equivocal and symbolic archways at midnight he bedded with the women he paid them when he had the money, and when he did not have it he bedded them anyway, and then told them that he was a Negro. For a while it worked. That was while he was still in the South. It was quite simply quite easy. Usually all he risked was a cursing from the woman and the matron of the house, though now and then he was beaten unconscious by other patrons to waken later in the street or in jail. Thus Joe's life as he moves over the course of a decade and a half. Well, note that we find here a chronicle of the same restlessness and resistance to authority and self-contempt as we've seen in Joe all along. Aspects of his character that Joe seems unable to change or to outrun. At the center of these travels is Joe's need as we've seen, to be punished by both races for the presence of both races within him. He rages against anyone, in particular, who accepts his blackness because he cannot accept it himself. Having suffered in his attempts to pass as white, Joe tries for a time to pass as black and to accept that part of his racial identity. But he finds that the white ingrained racial prejudice within him that he has absorbed, both in a sense genetically and from his own history living in the South, is too strong, and he cannot accept the black part of himself. He now tried living as man and wife with a woman who resembled an ivory carving, trying to breathe into himself the dark odor, the dark and inscrutable thinking of being of Negroes, with each suspiration trying to expel from himself the white blood and the white thinking and being, and all the while his nostrils at the odor which he was trying to make his own would whiten and tauten his whole being, writhe and strain with physical outrage and spiritual denial. No, he can't do it. He can't accept his blackness. Now, note that the white inheritance in Joe, though he despises it, cannot abide or accept the blackness or his belief in his blackness, because as he tells Joanna, he has only heard that he is part black, but he has always believed it, almost insisted upon believing it, rather than attempting to deny it. Indeed, Joe uses the idea of his blackness, as we've seen, to punish the white women he sleeps with and cannot pay, until, in the North, a prostitute unexpectedly says to him, after he tells her that he is part black, "What about it? You look all right." And she says that she has had men far blacker than he. In response, Joe beats her almost to death because he hates his own blackness too intensely to allow anyone in the white world to accept it. Then she quit talking. She was watching his face, and she began to move backwards, slowly, before him, staring at him, her face draining, her mouth open to scream. Then she did scream. It took 2 policemen to subdue him. At first they thought that the woman was dead. He was sick after that, and he stayed sick for 2 years. Sometimes he would remember how he had once tricked or teased white men into calling a Negro in order to fight them, to beat them, or be beaten. Now he fought the Negro who called him white. He wanted to be beaten. For this woman to accept that Joe is part black, and even to fetishize and welcome that blackness, is to magnify and legitimize a part of Joe that he associates with corruption and shame, that he despises. And this acceptance only increases his sense of hating that black blood within him. Again, his rage at this woman who accepts the blackness is really a rage at himself that demands punishment. Thus, we're told that after he beats her and the police subdue him but do not beat him, Joe must punish himself. He was sick after that, we are told, and he stayed sick for 2 years. He did not know that there were white women who would take a man with black skin before this. Now, Joe's sickness is not merely a self-induced form of self-punishment. In the largest sense, Joe's sickness is a psychic condition, not just of self-hatred, but of psychic confusion about who he is. And yet, paradoxically, Joe's chronic feeling of being a battleground of racial self-hatred, of being constantly torn with the white part of him hating the black and the black hating the white, that long-standing sense of the inner turbulence and war within his own nature is the one certainty, the one consistency, if you will, in his life. He does not know who he is, but he knows that there is a war going on within himself, and insofar as that is the only certainty, Joe clings to the rage and despair of that knowledge in the absence of any sense of himself. That is the only sense of self he really has. And he brings that rage and self-hatred with him to Joanna Bundreds, another white woman who craves black men, though for far more complicated reasons than the prostitute in the North. Well, chapters 10, 11, and 12 all describe Joe's relationship with Joanna, and I'm going to discuss them as a single narrative. Their 3-year relationship, which ends with Joe's murder of her, begins when he breaks in to her house and rapes her. And it's notable that he does this after watching the house beforehand from the same grove of trees where he sits shortly before he goes off to kill her. So it's almost as if his last entry into the house was ineluctably foreshadowed by the first one, which began in the same place on her property. Well, hearing that this is the property and house of a white woman, Joe's misogyny and distrust of all white women and women in general prompt him to steal food rather than knocking at the door and asking for it. And as we've seen already, Joe associates accepting food from women, going back to Mrs. McGurkin, with coercion and with a kind of entrapment. Thus, he does not want to be given this food. He doesn't want to owe a debt. When he climbs into the window then to take the food from the kitchen, his responses to Joanna are saturated with the traumatic associations he has with those other women whom he hated and linked with food. We're told now that perhaps he thought of that other window which he had used to use, and of the rope upon which he had had to rely. Perhaps not. He ate something from an invisible dish now, with invisible fingers, invisible food. He did not care what it would be. He did not know what he had even wondered or tasted until his jaw stopped suddenly in mid-chewing and thinking fled for 25 years back down that long street. And translating his feelings in italics, I'll know it in a minute. I've eaten it before, somewhere. In a minute I will. Memory clicking, chewing, knowing. I see more than her. I hear my head bent. I hear the monotonous, dogmatic voice, which I believe will never cease, going on forever and forever and forever. Ah, it's peas, he said aloud. For sweet Jesus, field peas, cooked with molasses. Eating in the dark kitchen carries 2 unpleasant memories of women for Joe that are entwined with food. The emotive memory of sneaking into the dietitian's room and gorging himself to the point of sickness on toothpaste, and the taste of peas, which comes to his mind not emotively but consciously through an involuntary taste recall that might suggest Proust, which brings him back, of course, to Mrs. McGurkin. That was the food that she had prepared for him. In short, eating Joanna's food now, because he is hungry and needs to survive, eating that food reignites Joe's violent hatred and suspicion of women, which is bound up with food. As he eats, Joanna enters the kitchen and reinforces his unwanted memories of food as an instrument of female control. When Joanna says to him, "If it's just food you want, you'll find it." But it's not just food now. As Joe sees her holding the candle, quote, grave and utterly unalarmed, as he sees her staring at him, all his aggressive hatred of women returns. And that night, having already associated her now with Mrs. McGurkin and with the dietitian, as he returns that night, we learn that he mounts the stairs in the house, enters Joanna's bedroom, and rapes her in an attempt to punish her for her kindness and to punish himself, because he finds that kindness humiliating and manipulative and hates himself for eating. He began to tear at her clothes. He was talking to her in a tense, hard, low voice. "I'll show you, I'll show the bitch." She did not resist at all. It was almost as though she were helping him with small position changes of her limbs. But beneath his hands, the body might have been the body of a dead woman, not yet stiffened. But he did not desist. Though his hands were hard and urgent, it was with rage alone. At least I've made a woman of her at last, he told himself. Now, I thought, now she hates me. I've taught her that at least. She must hate me, because after all, he hates himself. Joe can understand hatred. It's the possibility of acceptance or the possibility of love that threatens him as what he regards as a female trick, because he can never accept or love himself. Thus, he's eager to prove to himself that Joanna is like all other women, demanding, deceitful, using food to forge an emotional bond, and like the dietitian, quote, watching him with a perspicacious and still contempt. Later, when Joe finds the kitchen door is unlocked, but that the house door is still locked, he is all too eager to take that locked door of the house as an insult to his manhood, and so he hurls food around the kitchen then, calling it women's muck, and he hurls the dishes against the wall, just, you'll recall, as he had overturned the tray that Mrs. McGurkin had brought him. Quote, she's like all the rest of them, he soon thinks of Joanna, whether they're 17 or 47. But Joanna is not quite like all the other women, and her difference intrigues Joe. It torments him because it intrigues him, and it keeps him on her property. During the rape, Joanna not only submitted to it, but afterward, curiously, allowed Joe to stay on the grounds despite it. A few months later, she begins to welcome Joe's visits to her bed as a nightly ritual. She leaves food for Joe to eat and then awaits his visits each night. These impersonal trysts mark the beginning of what Faulkner describes as the first of 3 phases in Joe and Joanna's relationship. In the first phase, Joanna fascinates Joe by wanting him to reenact his initial violent sexual assault, to violate and divergenate her again and again as if each night it was for the first time. And when he entered the house at night, it was as he had entered it the first night. He felt like a thief, a robber, even while he mounted to the bedroom where she waited. Even after a year, it was though he entered by stealth to despoil her virginity, a spiritual privacy so long intact that its instinct for preservation had immolated it. Now, you'll note that she waits for this. Joanna, the spinster virgin, finds sexual pleasure in being overcome, but particularly in being overcome when now, unlike during the rape, she is engaged in an act of resistance. Now she struggles in a way that she had not early struggled during the rape, but which becomes part of the essential conditions for her erotic gratification. It was as if he had struggled physically with another man for an object of no actual value to either, for which they struggled on principle alone. When he saw her next, he thought, my God, how little I know about women. When I thought I knew so much, my God, he thought, it's like I was the woman now and she was the man. And that was not right either, because she had resisted to the very last. Joe, too, like Joanna, finds perverse satisfaction in this repeated performance of rape, which is orchestrated between the two of them, because these performances discharge both his sexual need and also his need to inflict violence on his sexual partner. For Joanna, this prescriptive nightly struggle is paradoxically both a form of long-delayed sexual release and, at the same time, an illusory moral self-defense for that gratification. Joe's reenactment of a rape provides her with the pretense that she is not yielding to sexual sin by her own wishes, even though it's partly her design, but is rather being overcome as she struggles against it. Now, we learn the origins of this peculiar self-delusional attitude in Joanna when she comes to tell Joe about her family history. Some critics have argued that this rather extended chronicle goes on longer than it should, and delays the development of the doomed relationship between Joe and Joanna. But the family history, I think, is important. It is, after all, the earliest historical period in the entire novel, and it reveals, therefore, the hereditary forces that keep Joanna Burton in the town where she is viewed still with distrust and aversion, the same distrust and aversion that the town felt for her father as well as her grandfather and her older brother, both abolitionist Yankees who were shot to death in Jefferson during the Reconstruction for their efforts on behalf of the freed slaves. Their killer was an ex-slave holder named Colonel Sartoris, and in Faulkner's world, he is the most illustrious member of the Southern aristocracy. He is a Civil War hero. Well, those killings occurred before Joanna was even born, but she knows that the bodies had to be buried in a hidden location on the family property for fear that racist whites would dig them up and mutilate them. And this information prompts Joe to ask a question that is at the very heart of this novel and at the very heart of his life. The question is, just when do men that have different blood in them stop hating one another? Another way might say it is, when do men who have both white and black bloods in them stop hating themselves? But the question about the relationship of racial blood and hatred is crucial. And in response to the question of when men with different racial blood stop hating one another, Joanna simply and hopelessly responds with her own question: when do they? Joe, when he speaks of different blood, is referring both to family bloodlines and racial bloodlines. They both know that what we inherit from these bloodlines, our family and our race, is inescapable. And the coexistence of racial bloodlines, after all, is the root of Joe Christmas's self-hatred, and the inheritance of the Burton family bloodline and the dead buried nearby her are part of the legacy that Joanna has inherited and that has kept her in Jefferson for 41 years. They are both dominated by blood inheritance. Well, part of Joanna's inheritance is the pro-Negro zeal, which she practices, having inherited it from her grandfather, which she practices by working on behalf of black colleges across the South, by offering business advice to trustees and female students. But there is another familial legacy in Joanna, and that is the morbid religious ideology that originates in the strange Protestantism of her abolitionist New England grandfather, and that undergirded his activism, and that she has inherited. It is an inheritance that Joanna struggles against, but ultimately, as we shall see, she cannot escape this particular form of religious legacy. Her destiny is written, after all, in her last name, Burton. The advancement of the black race is the burden she must bear as a white woman, and the religion she has inherited demands this. It's her family legacy. It is a burden, as we shall see, in itself. Joanna recites to Joe her father's words when he stood with her at the family grave site, and it explains much about her. I think it was something, she said, about Father, something that came from the cedar grove to me through him, something that I felt that he had put on the cedar grove, and that when I went into it, the grove would put on me, so that I would never be able to forget it. I don't know, but he made me go in, and the two of us standing there, he said, "Remember this, your grandfather and brother are lying there, murdered, not by one white man, but by the curse which God put on a whole race before your grandfather or your brother or me or you were even thought of, a race doomed and cursed to be forever and ever a part of the white race's doom, and curse for its sins. The curse of every white child that ever was born and that ever will be born. None can escape it." And I said, "Not even me?" And he said, "Not even you. least of all you. I seemed to see them for the first time then, not as people, but as a thing, my ancestors, a shadow in which I lived. We lived, all white people, all other people. I thought of all the children coming forever and ever into the world, white with the black shadow already falling upon them before they drew breath. And I seemed to see the black shadow in the shape of a cross. And it seemed like the white babies were struggling, even before they drew breath, to escape from the shadow that was on them, only upon them, but not all, but beneath them too, flung out, like their arms was flung out, as if they were nailed to a cross. I wanted to tell him that I must escape. I wanted to tell my father. I wanted to get away from under that shadow, or if I wouldn't, die. You cannot, he said. You must struggle, rise. But in order to rise, you must raise the shadow with you. But you can never lift it to your own level. I see that now, which I did not see until I came down here. But escape it, you cannot. The curse of the black race is God's curse, but the curse of the white race is the black man. Well, the perversity of this particular strain of New England Protestantism that Joanna's father describes to her, because he has inherited it from his father and passed it on to her, as we are told here, as if something moving through them. The particular strain of its perversity is that both black and white races, in this view, are cursed by God. The white race is cursed by God for its sins against the black race, specifically the sin of slavery, the guilt for which Joanna and all whites must, according to this moral logic, atone and suffer. For whites who inherit this guilt, blacks are the cross that they must bear, the burden, the shadow of racial guilt, so described, that falls upon whites from their birth and that they must live under until their death. This vision of a generational racial guilt, in itself, you might say, is consistent with Faulkner's own secular vision of white guilt as passed through Southern generations for the original sin of slavery. But what makes the vision that Joanna's father describes and that Joanna has inherited so perverse is that blacks are also cursed by God in it. They are a race, quote, doomed and cursed to be forever a part of the white man's doom and curse for its sins. The curse of the black race is God's curse on it, and the curse of the white race is the black man. Well, within this illogical orthodoxy, it is as if God created blacks first to tempt the white man to sin against them, and then to serve as punishment for that sin by making the white man guilty for what he has done. In short, this vision converts the entire black race into the cursed instrument of a perverse and punishing creator. Now, when we see Joe's grandfather, Doc Hines, we'll learn that his Southern fundamentalism is perverse in a different way. It holds that God created whites not to suffer for blacks in guilt, but rather God created whites to rule over blacks, justifying slavery and oppression according to Scripture, which he has the audacity to preach in black churches. That ancestry contributes, of course, to Joe's hatred of his own blackness, and it is for Faulkner the most egregious moral failing of the Calvinist tradition. It is even more toxic than McGurkin's life-denying view of man's intrinsic sinfulness and need to mortify his senses. Well, both Hines and McGurkin's strains of fundamentalist Protestantism are monstrous in their cultural transmission and assimilation across generations. They're more extreme forms of what Hightower encounters in his congregation when he arrives in Jefferson. But this New England strain that Joanna has absorbed from her forebears isn't much better, or isn't, one might say, less perverse or oppressive than the Southern variants. The sense of a double curse on both races by some wicked creator, as well as the emphasis in this theology she's inherited of the evils of sexual sin, this sense that man is created too weak to resist, but afflicted by guilt by a cruel, all-seeing God. That particular New England theology helps to explain Joanna's need to evade her sexual guilt with Joe, even as she practices fornication. It explains a great deal about, in short, that paradoxical need to gratify herself by reenacting a rape that she is complicit in, while at the same time convincing herself that she's absolved from it because she's trying to fend it off. This heritage she has absorbed also explains Joanna's conflicted feelings about Joe as a black lover. On the one hand, she has been taught to love and serve the Negro race as the burden the white man or white woman must endure. And that, of course, makes Joe all the more attractive to her. But on the other hand, the black race was cursed by God, and every birth, that is, every sex-engendered act of conception, perpetuates God's curse on both the black and white races. So, when Joanna later imagines that she is pregnant, she thinks that bearing a black bastard child would, in one sense, be, quote, a full measure of service to blacks, her inherited duty. But, on the other hand, it would be a sacrilegious violation that she enjoys pondering. I would like to see father and grandfather's faces if I gave birth to a black child, if, after all, the black man is God's cursed, or is cursed by God. Now, at the end of her chronicle, Joanna asks Joe if he is sure if, in fact, he is black, to which Joe responds, quote, "If I'm not, damned if I haven't wasted a lot of time." There's a grim humor in that. While Joe hates his blackness, he also firmly believes in it, and he must, because otherwise nothing in his past life makes sense. And there is no meaning in his lifelong rage against the world in himself if, in fact, he cannot believe that he is of mixed race. He would rather cling to that sense of blackness and to the war inside him that it has to create as a terrible certainty than to question it. Well, Joanna's disclosure of her history is an act of confession, and as such, it frees her to rebel against the moral and religious strictures of her grandparents and father insofar as she can. Yet, she yields only when it becomes clear that she can temporarily cast that off. So she yields then to her long-suppressed sexual desires, and in the second phase of her relationship with Joe, she becomes not one who enacts a kind of resistance sexually, but rather becomes now an active nymphomaniac, much to Joe's astonishment. Joe now feels, quote, as if he had fallen into a sewer, into a morass of female sexual desire and moral corruption, something he's always associated with women and that now Joanna seems fully to embody. Because now Joanna is rebelling against her religious past, and in so doing, in cultivating and embracing her own depraved eroticism, she consigns herself to damnation, both for the pleasure of her own voluptuous release, but also for corrupting a black man who, according to her family legacy, she should be saving and serving and advancing in the world, not drawing into the sewer of sexuality. For a whole week, she forced Joe to climb into a window to come to her. He would do so, and sometimes he would have to seek her out in the dark house until he found her hidden in closets and empty rooms, waiting, panting, her eyes in the dark glowing like the eyes of cats. And now and then she appointed tryst beneath certain bushes about the grounds, where he would find her naked or with her clothing half torn to ribbons upon her in the wild throes of nymphomania. She would be wild then in the close-breathing, half-dark, without walls, with her wild hair, each strand of which would seem to come alive like octopus tentacles, and her wild hands and her breathing, "Negro, Negro, Negro," she would say. Within 6 months, she was completely corrupted. Joanna's behavior reifies all of Joe's worst most elemental fears about women as sources of corruption, what he feels to be, quote, a rotten richness flowing into putrefaction at his touch. But Faulkner tells us that Joe nonetheless remains there at Joanna's property, fatalistically due to three things, quote, curiosity, pessimism, and sheer inertia. That statement is rich with implication, and let us unpack each of those words. Joe's curiosity lies in, quote, the fury of a New England glacier exposed suddenly to the fire of hell, and by her middle-aged sexual release and the spectacle of two Joannas warring, quote, like two creatures in one body. This fascinates Joe. And indeed, that notion of two creatures warring in one body may fascinate him in part because it's a fit description of himself, psychosexually and racially. He sees it in her sexually. This voluptuous struggle against her own inherited religious past. Fascinated, curious. His pessimism, on the other hand, lies in Joe's feelings that, quote, he could not escape, that he was bound both by his own sexual desire for Joanna and by the irresistible pleasures of corruption, the same feeling of being wicked that she has, a kind of forlorn transgression, much as he had experienced briefly with Bobby when he knew she was a prostitute and a harlot and sunk himself into it anyway. Now this sense of a Faustian bargain in which he simply descends into perdition fills him with an even greater sense of pessimism, but a pessimism rooted in the sense that he cannot cast it off. And finally, he is bound to stay by what Faulkner describes as sheer inertia. It is exhaustion. Exhaustion in a man who has been on the run for 15 years, had been, and who is tired and has now fallen into a comfortable routine as his aging mistress runs the gamut of erotic experiments, even as she grows older and fatter. He's tired of running. Well, foreseeing the coming autumn and foreseeing the biological change that will surely come in Joanna's life, the end of this phase of delirious self-damnation, seeing that, Joanna paradoxically prays to God to not have to pray. Prays to God, that is, to be able to sin against him a little bit longer after so many years of painful celibacy. That is to say, give me just a little bit more time to enjoy myself before menopause, even though I know I'm damned. What was terrible was that she did not want to be saved. I'm not ready to pray yet, she said aloud, quietly, rigid, soundless, her eyes wide open, while the moon poured and poured into the window, filling the room with something cold and irrevocable and wild with regret. Don't make me have to pray yet, dear God. Let me be damned a little longer, for just a little while. But as we know already, menopause does come soon for Joanna, and its arrival initiates the third and final phase of their relationship, the one that drives Joanna back to God now in the idiom of her New England religious heritage, and that also drives Joe to murder her. It is at the start of this phase that Brown arrives and becomes Joe's bootlegging partner, 6 months before the opening of the novel, the fictional present. Well, at first, Joanna tries to believe that she's pregnant with Joe's child, but her missed period indicates that she is beyond childbearing. And when he refuses to marry her, Joanna leaves a note for him in his cabin that announces this new phase in their relationship. Joe's refusal to open that note indicates his unwillingness to admit or accept what he fears the note contains, but which he does not want to accept, that she is now asking him not to marry her any longer, but rather in this note is asking Joe to submit to a kind of secular and spiritual salvation. Instead, as he dresses to go to her as a lover, Joe thinks she is still she and I am still I, trying to deny her menopause much as he had earlier tried to deny menstruation. But of course, she isn't still as she was. In this third phase, Joanna, having lost much of her sexual ardor and under the increasingly urgent influence of her family's religious ancestry, she proposes now to save Joe. She does so first by offering to put him in charge of her business affairs, and then by urging him to enroll as a black man in one of the black colleges that she supports, with the ultimate aim of becoming a lawyer, quote, to help your race out of the darkness. Everything about these offers enrages Joe. The female possessiveness, the moral rigidity, the condescension, the emphasis on a blackness that he hates in himself, and perhaps above all, the suggestion that he, as a lawyer, should practice the law as an attorney rather than continuing to break it, which he's done his whole life. Now, just as Joe thought of Joanna, just as he thought of her pregnancy as a trick that she was playing upon him, and thought of it as a way of trying to get him to marry her, so too he now regards these offers from her as a bribe. He sees them as a bribe Joanna is making with herself to try to appease her conscience at a time for her sexual misdeeds, at a time hypocritically when her own erotic desire has dried up and died. He would have died or murdered rather than have anyone, another man, learn what their relations in this phase had now become. That not only had she changed her life completely, but that she was trying to change his too and make him something between a hermit and a missionary to Negroes. Joe tells her contemptuously that she is old, and when she slaps him in return, he strikes her with his fist, to which she responds, "Maybe it would be better if we were both dead." Well, this is Joe's helpless desire as well throughout the course of the novel, to die. Death is the only possible way for him to achieve what he repeatedly calls peace. Well, already, without naming it, Joe has begun to think, quote, "There is something I am going to do." Now, we know these words from earlier in the novel, leading up to the murder. And we also know that, to use Joe's phrase, the right one, Brown is not the right one. She is the right one in every sense to murder. She's a white woman who fetishizes his blackness and is an exponent of the Protestant God he hates, and she is one who has, he believed, deceived him and tries to control him. Everything about her makes her fit for murder, a murder that he knows will ultimately destroy him. Yet Joe also, as always, is in need of punishment in any act of aggression. So even as he is instinctively moving toward an act of murder long before he allows himself to articulate it to himself, he lays the groundwork for his capture in advance by allowing Brown to follow him to Joanna's so that Brown will be aware that they are having a misogynistic affair. Even though he punches Brown for following him, he allows him to do it. But even more, he tells Brown that he is part black. Brown, a man of no account, a man he doesn't trust. Nonetheless, he tells him in a way that can only be self-incriminating and self-destructive. He could have concealed both of these things, both the affair and his racial mixing, but he didn't. Joe Christmas feels that the murder he will commit is inevitable. Only when Joanna, however, adds to her other intolerable and coercive proposals a request that he kneel to pray with her for God's forgiveness of their sexual sin. Only then does Joe feel that the killing is so necessary as to be predestined. And as we've seen, because he feels this sense of its destiny, he feels as if it has already occurred and has occurred before it has occurred through some force outside or beyond him. Your soul, she said, expiation of, and he was waiting cold still until she had finished, hell forever and ever and ever. He catches words as she is preaching to him. No, he said, and she would listen as quietly, and he knew that she was not convinced, that she knew that he was not convinced. Neither would surrender, and they would stand for a little longer in the quiet dusk, people, as though from their loins by a myriad of ghosts of dead sins and delights haunting them, which she wants him to atone for, and he adamantly refuses, notwithstanding the guilt that he feels as well. He believed with calm paradox that he was the volitionless servant of the fatality in which he believed that he did not believe. He was saying to himself, I had to do it, already in the past tense. I had to do it. She said so herself before the deed was ever done and before the it is ever consciously identified in his mind as killing. In a moment of lucidity, however, just before the murder, Joe understands that his upcoming murder of a white woman is the final act in a pattern of violence against the world and against himself that has defined his entire existence. Insofar as Joe achieves any kind of self-understanding, this is one of the moments in which he recognizes a fundamental tragic consistency. Then there was just one other thing to do. There's just one other thing to do, he said. So now it's all done, all finished, he thought quietly, sitting in the dense shadow of the shrubbery, hearing the last stroke of the far-off clock cease and die away. Through all the past, he saw a flat pattern, and going on, tomorrow night, all the tomorrows to be a part of the flat pattern, all going on. He thought of that with quiet astonishment, going on, myriad familiar, since all that had ever been was the same as all that was to be, since tomorrow to be and had been would all be the same. When Joe enters Joanna's bedroom with the razor and again refuses to pray at her request, quote, for the last time, in response to that refusal, Joanna pulls out an ancient pistol, a relic of the ancestors who have shaped her life and this self-punishing religious attitude and the fetishizing of blacks. She pulls out that pistol, that vestige of the past, with the intention of using it to punish them both by ending their lives. The pistol contains 2 rounds, with which she intends to kill Joe and then to turn it on herself in a murder-suicide. It is only when Joe finds himself holding that pistol as he flees, having killed her, that he and we realize that that was indeed what Joanna had intended to do with it. He still seemed to see the ancient thing with its 2 loaded chambers, the one upon which the hammer had already fallen and which had not exploded, and the other upon which no hammer had yet fallen, but upon which a hammer had been planned to fall. Ah, he thought, for her and for me. Now, we don't see either Joanna's firing of the round of the pistol at Joe, nor do we see Joe's slitting of Joanna's throat with the razor. Joe takes the pistol, though, from the bedroom and discovers that he has it only when he jumps out of a car that he has flagged down while he's running away from the scene. The occupants of that car, who seem to him to be eloping, are terrified by the gun that Joe doesn't even know he's holding. So dissociative is he after a murder that he felt he'd committed beyond his volition, as if it had already occurred before it did and somehow been enacted by something outside himself. Joe throws the gun away and runs, as he had earlier been running, and hopelessly for 15 years, and will run from now until the end of the novel and his death. Okay, I will